All right, hello, welcome. This is class two of Ain on Lu, which is a ridiculous title, which I gave this program. And last week, we gave a little bit of an introduction into who Rabbi Lu was, his significance here in San Francisco, and just an overview of his approach to the month of Elul. And we closed at the end of last week with just the idea that, can you take one thing? Maybe there would be one thing that you would pay a little bit more attention to this upcoming month. So I'm not going to ask you to share that. I'm just going to remind you that Rabbi Lu has suggested that just take one thing, whether it's eating too fast or whatever it might be, and just slow down and take a moment. All right, so what I wanted to do, this class, session two, is titled Spirituality and Social Justice. And of course, Rabbi Lu was well known for his activism here in San Francisco. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Rabbi Lu was well known for sleeping on the sidewalks of San Francisco. His outreach to the homeless was legendary, as was his opposition to the death penalty. And apparently I have heard, stood vigil at every capital punishment execution that took place in opposition to that. So what I want to do today is dig a little bit into the theology and the thinking behind what Rabbi Lu understood as social justice and how it is connected to this sense of spirituality. And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to play a lot of audio. So one of the beautiful things about Zoom is we can have this conversation and we can do it. But one of the things that's hard about Rabbi Lu is much of his paperwork. In fact, a whole television series called Mosaic, which maybe some of you remember. All of those videotapes, VHS tapes, are in Boulder, Colorado. And so there is a dearth of audio and visual material at the moment. However, once COVID clears, I'd love to take a trip out to Boulder, Colorado and bring back some findings. I have a VHS player, I have a Betamax, and I can convert it into digital stuff. So I have all of my dad's old footage, which I've overboarded you with at this point. So I think it might be fun to maybe head out there. I looked through the stacks in Boulder, and they have all the VHS tapes for every television show he's done. So maybe that would be a good project in our centennial year. But I found a wonderful talk that really goes to the heart of what we're going to do. And I'm going to walk us through this talk of his. Now, click on gallery. I would click on gallery mode so you're just not looking at the icon of the audio. Or I would suggest closing your eyes. One of the things that has been a lot of fun for me is Rabbi Lu is now a living presence in my life. First of all, I never knew Rabbi Lu. I never had the privilege of meeting him, but I feel like his voice and his words are alive for me here, and I think they're necessary. And so my hope is that we can make them alive for us in this community. And so hearing his voice, I think, does that. And so he's going to start our talk today with a midrash. Okay, so I hope everybody put on your headphones and close your eyes. I'm going to be stopping and then asking for commentary. So just imagine that I was reading a piece of text and then coming back to you and asking you for commentary. Okay, so he's going to begin here with this midrash. Okie dokie. And just nod if you can hear, please. Oh, hold on, I don't.
It's a wonderful midrash in Pirkei the Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Joshua and Yochanan ben Zakkai are walking through Jerusalem when they come upon the ruins of the Temple Mount, where they lived after the destruction of the first temple. And Rabbi Joshua, when he saw the temple in ruins, he started to cry. And he said, "Oi, you know, that's a very old word. You may think that that's like a product of Eastern Europe, but it's actually a biblical word, which also appears many times in the Talmud. Oi. Hear me out. Jeremiah says oi all the time. And in this case, Rabbi Joshua says also, Oy lanu al ze shehu charev makom shemekaprim bo. It says, Be'ezmir, because of that which was destroyed, the place where we experienced God's forgiveness. So, what do we do now? So Yochanan ben Zakkai says, Beni, Ayer Alecho, my son, forget about it. Don't worry about it. Yesh lanu kapara acheret shehi kamota. We have another form of achieving atonement, achieving God's forgiveness. That's just as good as the one that we used to get in the Great Temple before it was destroyed. The Ezel, Gimelut Chasadim. Gimelut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Shene Emar. Ki chesed chafatzti v'lo zebach. Because it's your kindness I want, not your sacrifices. That's a quote from Micah or Hosea or one of those guys. So the temple was the place where we experienced the divine presence, divine forgiveness. What do we do now that there's no temple anymore? Gimelut chesed, clothe the naked, feed the hungry, bring the poor and the homeless into your home. And for many of us, there's a tension in this midrash. And it exposes our misconceptions about both spirituality and social action. For many of us, I think, spiritual.
Okay. What do we think the misconceptions are going to be? I can let him run, and there's a lot of, he's hard to cut off. But what do you think the misconceptions are going to be that he's going to address? What did you think of the Midrash? The Midrash, just to reiterate, the Midrash stated that there's this sobbing, this crying over the destruction of the temple. This is where we found forgiveness. And there's another type of atonement. The type of atonement is doing acts of Gemilut Chasadim, righteous kindness. And so what's the tension, do you think, that he's going to get at the heart of spirituality and social justice here? What do you think? Is it really I'm trying to figure out, is it a straw man or is it a real tension that exists? Yeah, go, Ben.
Well, I mean, it could be that we assume there's a duality there when there is no duality. It's the same thing.
Ah, good. The oneness. Beautiful. So there's a oneness, this idea, this notion of separating me from the other. So here he goes and he explains. I'll continue going here.
Is something we do for ourselves. And this is the Emersonian idea of spirituality. You can blame this idea on Ralph Waldo Emerson. And this idea eventually became the American idea, our idea, that spirituality is a form of personal gratification, a private, deeply subjective matter. And the idea has come to dominate the American spiritual and religious landscape, even as resolutely a communitarian enterprise as Judaism has had to come to terms with it. In order to compete in the American spiritual marketplace, Judaism has found itself giving personal spiritual gratification a considerably larger place in the Jewish spiritual landscape than it had traditionally occupied. The emphasis on personal gratification has given rise to a strong negative misconception about spirituality, especially among people who don't like spirituality very much. And that is that spirituality is navel worship, that it leads inescapably to self-absorption, a turning away from the world. Of course, anyone who has seen a real spiritual community knows that this is not the case.
So Rabbi Lew is going to address some of the misconceptions of both what people think spirituality is and what people think social justice is. And I think those misconceptions continue to this day. Shira writes exactly right. Spirituality as individual level, not group, as a focus on the internal and on the individual. So I'm just wondering, do we think that our faith has been molded in that way towards the individual and away from the community?
No.
No, Lisa doesn't think so.
No.
It just seems so interesting because, at least to me, I think of Makom Shalom, which seems to be an entirely internal place that, was another huge facet of, again, what I understand to be Rabbi Lew's spirituality.
That's right. And so there's this seemingly contradiction for those who don't know Rabbi Lew. Thank you, David. Those who don't know Rabbi Lew, haven't sat with Rabbi Lew, it's okay. You're just going to go, you're going to sit in silence in Makom Shalom, and you're going to, as he used the expression, navel worship. And I don't understand. I thought we're supposed to go out and do acts of Gimilut Chesed. So he is trying to point out to a superficial contradiction that he is going to unpack for us. Steve, did you want to say something? No, he did not. Okay.
No, it took me a whole lot of time to connect for some reason.
Well, we're glad you're here. We're sharing some of Rabbi Lew's words on spirituality and social justice. And one of the things he's pointing out is there seems to be this contradiction, as if spirituality is somehow antithetical to social justice. Spirituality, meditation can be perceived from afar as navel gazing, where social justice is, why are you bothering navel gazing? Go out and do stuff. And if Judaism tells us that the real source of atonement is going out and doing acts of Gimilut Chasadim, how do we explain this desire to have these moments of meditation and spirituality? How is that not in conflict? Okay, so Rabbi Lew's going to go
on. In Japan, when Buddhism was in its fullest flower, every Buddhist monastery was responsible for all the people, every single living person between it and the nearest neighboring monastery. And this was a very direct, present tense kind of responsibility. If someone cried out, the monastery responded. If someone was hungry, the monastery saw to it that they had food. Even stray cats were thrown over the monastery walls because everyone knew that if no one else in the world would take care of a cat, the monastery would. When I used to practice at the San Francisco Zen Center, I remember I sat a session there, and they came in and explained to us before the session started that if we were sitting during the session and a cry went out on the street, and this frequently happened, by the way, because the San Francisco Zen Center in those days was in a dangerous neighborhood, a block away from one of the city's largest housing projects. And in fact, Chris Persig, the son of Robert Persig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, was killed right outside in that neighborhood, right outside the Zen Center. So anyway, the rule was, but if we were sitting and we heard a cry, we were to get up immediately, find out what the problem was, and do whatever we could to take care of it. And they explained to us at the beginning of a week retreat like this. And when Jews lived in coherent spiritual communities, those communities took the same kind of direct responsibility for their members. They fed the hungry, housed the homeless, visited the sick, comforted mourners, raised funds for penniless brides, and performed various other acts of Gemilut Chesed, acts of loving kindness, acts of direct hands-on caring in the present moment. That's what distinguishes Gemilut Chesed from Tzedakah. Gemilut Chesed is active, direct, hands-on caring in the present moment. Acts which sought to meet the immediate needs one saw in front of one's face. So the Emersonian idea of spirituality as personal gratification is not affirmed by the real spiritual communities one observes for the most part. Yet the misconception persists. And we're equally afflicted by misconceptions about social action.
All right, so just to pause here for a second, pretty heavy, right? I see Don exhaling there. It's a lot there to take in. So this idea, of course, that when spiritual communities come together and they meditate together, real lived experience of spiritual communities doesn't end up looking the way that the misconception thinks. Judah.
It's also a tenet of Musar. And I think Rabbi Salanter, I think it's his quote that something to the effect that my material situation is not my spiritual concern, but your material situation Beautiful. Is my spiritual concern.
Amen. Amen. That's correct. Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so now comes the part I'm going to inject my little Ein Rashi on Rabbi Lew here. This next part, that was the preamble. That was the setup for what comes next, which is about social justice and why social justice is so significant and how we can misunderstand it or get it wrong. And so he wants to clear up misunderstandings on both the spiritual side and now the social justice side. And for me, this is significant because it's something I feel as a rabbi, I have felt it over the last number of years, in that there is a strong desire to justice, to do justice, tzedek, tirdof, which is we want to get things right. We want to right past wrongs. We want justice to be fair. We want everything. We want things to be right. And in the process, in making things right and just, people sometimes get squished in that, and we can lose a sense of our heart and the actions of Gimilut Chesed. And Gimilut Chesed, and Chesed isn't based on justice, right? You give Chesed to anybody. And I often see Gimilut Chesed and Tzedakah and Tzedek as two sides of a coin, which are both completely necessary. But my concern has been in this town is we love Tzedek. We love justice. We love getting things right. But to get people to go and to do Gimilut Chasadim, is a little bit of a harder thing. And sometimes it's easier to check along on a campaign in social media and have the need of the person, attenuated or distanced from you. And so what Rabbi Lew is talking about and the atonement that we want to get to during this month of Elul is not a type of campaign that we're participating in to achieve some side of absolute justice and rightness, but rather to get our hands dirty, to go out on the street and to be with the suffering of real human beings who are infleshed and to sit with them and to help them. And that is the distinction. And I love the fact that he is going to point this out here. And I think it's very relevant to our world today. So I'm going to let him go a little bit, and I'm going to stop before he gets to, we also learn about Rabbi Lew. What do we learn about Rabbi Lew? We're going to learn in the section who one of his favorite rabbis is. Anybody know who one of Rabbi Lew's favorite rabbis is? Name me one of Rabbi Lew's favorite rabbis. Go. Anybody? Rabbi Robert Zimmerman. Rabbi Robert Zimmerman. He's going to quote at length from Rabbi Robert Zimmerman. So feel free to close your eyes and enjoy this next selection here, which talks about the misunderstanding between social justice and Gimilut Chasadim.
Social justice. And these misconceptions frequently doom our efforts in this arena. There's an old Japanese saying, an inch in the beginning is a mile at the end. Those, if you're a little bit off in the very beginning, by the time you get to the end, you're way off. If we begin our efforts for social justice with good intentions, but with the wrong idea of what we're doing, the result will be way off. We come to believe, for example, that something's wrong. It's up to us to fix it. we come to believe, for example, that the obligation for social justice requires us to stoop down and help those below us, those who are weaker and less powerful than we are. But this kind of thinking only serves to fortify delusions about our own power and to affirm the sense of powerlessness in the people we're bending down to help. And in the long run, it can do more harm than good. It weakens them, and it makes us arrogant. Or our idea of social justice feeds our addiction to oppositional behavior. If the impulse to engage in social action flows from some vague notion of doing or being good, then we need bad guys to measure ourselves against. The important thing is to be on the right team. This is the social justice of the false cuirass, to use Kurt Vonnegut's great term. Us against them, a brand of social justice found frequently on the op-ed pages. And there are, after all, always people around to despise. Rednecks, clanners, ditto heads, Sarah Palin, Joe the plumber, which are political beliefs place us in sharp contrast, usually to our benefit. And this, like the first strategy, keeps us in a constant state of opposition and conflict. But these strategies for social justice are strategies of separation. And that is a contradiction in terms. Real social justice, real healing, depends on wholeness and reconciliation. And it is precisely here in the urge for wholeness that the realms of social justice and spirituality intersect. The truth is, spirituality and social justice are indispensable to one another. There can be no real spirituality, no sense of spiritual liberation if some of us are left behind, and no social justice without an authentic base in spirituality. And because this all might seem quite counterintuitive, I call upon that famous counterintuitive, Rabbi Zimmerman, to help us out. Broken lives, broken strings, broken threads, broken springs, broken idols, broken heads, people sleeping in broken beds. No use jiving, no use joking. Everything's broken. Broken bottles, broken plates, broken switches, broken gates, broken dishes, broken pots. Streets are filled with broken hearts. Only Rabbi Zimmerman can rhyme pots with hearts. Broken pots, streets are filled with broken hearts. Broken words never meant to be spoken. Everything's broken. Seems like every time you turn around, something else just hit the ground. Every time you leave and go off someplace, things fall to pieces in my face. So this song captures very precisely to me, the sense of brokenness we feel in the world these days, the sense of things gone horribly awry, of nothing working, and our attempts to repair them only seeming to make matters worse. The economy, the environment, the increasingly futile quest for peace, our families, our hopes, our dreams, everything seems broken. And since we ourselves are broken, we seem powerless to fix it. This is the bad news. The good news, of course, is that it's always been this way. This, at least, is the testimony of the rabbis of the Kabbalah. This brokenness is not a special feature of our world or our time. This is how things have been literally since the time of creation. According to Kabbalah, according to Lurianic Kabbalah in particular, before creation, God existed in a primordial state known alternatively as the Ein Sof, the endlessness, literally without end, and the Ayin, the emptiness. But this endless emptiness was such a powerfully charged state that nothing could coexist with it. Nothing could withstand it. So in order to create the universe, in order to create anything at all, the Ein Sof had to perform an operation known as Tzimtzum. It had to contract itself, to remove itself from a tiny speck at the center of its vast and radiant emptiness. And this tiny speck was creation, the universe as we know it. But in the middle of this Tzimtzum, this contraction of divine light, a catastrophe occurred. Kabbalists call this catastrophe Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. The divine light was being hauled away from this tiny speck at the center of the Ein Sof in vessels called Kelim. But the light was too strong for the Kelim, and the Kelim broke. Shards of intolerable divine light were scattered all over the universe, throwing the world into chaos, creating a broken and dangerous world. The purpose of human existence, according to the Kabbalah, is tikkun olam, repairing the vessels, restoring the divine light to its place. Everything we can do to correct the brokenness of the world, from reciting prayers with the proper kavanot to serving meals in a soup kitchen, accomplishes this. Yet, and this is the kusha, this is the koan. In a thoroughly broken world, when we carry our own spiritual brokenness into everything we undertake, how can we expect to be the agents of real tikkun? How can we prevent our own brokenness from infecting and undermining and finally defeating every attempt we make to repair the world?
Yeah, Don.
Yeah, it seems like it's coming from this place that things are broken. And I'm wondering, as I sit here, it's like, I've been told that, and I read that, but that's an opinion. That's a point of view. Maybe things aren't broken. Maybe God or the contraction or the whole thing, maybe this is the way it's supposed to be. Maybe God is running everything, and in God's eyes, everything is perfect. And then if we don't come from that everything is broken, then we do just what's natural. If we know that everything is fine with God, and we are part of that, and the person on the street is part of that, and everything is part of that, and it's not broken, then we might have a different point of view on how we live here. And I think that would lead to genuine kindness. Not that I'm better than you or I'm going to give you and all that other stuff, but a genuine, after deep meditation.
It
happened.
It's interesting, Don. Thank you. He, in a section that I cut, because I wanted to sort of really hone in on the heart, and people have been texting. Yeah, it's very powerful and very resonant for me. I mean, I got choked up and just really felt like, oh my God, this is everything broken right now. Nothing works, and everything we do makes things worse. Boy, that sounds really relevant. What the section I cut out is this beautiful section, Don, in which he's explaining. He says that the best film I ever saw was a film of someone stuck a small video camera into the fallopian tubes and filmed the process of the insemination of the egg. And he said, you watch all of these sperm cells crash against the wall and crash against the wall and crash against the wall. And it seems like there's no purpose to any of this. But he said, but if you could do what you were just suggesting here, if you could pull out and saw that this process led to life, then maybe we could get to that point where some of that misunderstanding and some of that strife that we have between us could be alleviated. Thank you, Don. Steve.
Yes, actually, one reason I was late, Rabbi, I was in a long meeting with someone from JCRC who are putting together their 4-year strategy. And one of the things we talked a lot about is this social justice. What is social justice? For a lot of cases, it seems that it's easy for Jews to jump on someone else's bandwagon if other people are being discriminated against or persecuted. But if Jews are facing anti-Semitism, is fighting anti-Semitism, is that social justice? And just looking at what I've read about Jewish history, Jews are afraid to stand up for themselves. And how can we be committed to social justice if we're not defending other Jews and defending our way of life? And so just thinking about Rabbi Lew, he told me once, and I never forgot it, that when he went out in public with a kippah on, that kippah was a lightning rod. And so it attracted all kinds of things that you just assume not have to attract. And so we haven't really talked about it. Is defending other Jews against enemies, is that really critical to social justice?
So Steve is asking the question, who is it that we are trying to assist? Who is it that we're trying to help? And what qualifies as social justice? And so I think that your question leads right into what he's going with, which is, how do we understand social justice? And what are we talking about when we talk about social justice? Are we only talking about helping people who we have to, in his words, stoop down to, right? Give us a feeling of being greater than, and we need to help these folks? Or are we going into a realm of social justice with a kavanah, with the intention that we are all created in the image of God, and that what we have to do is we have to find a way to see that in each other person and support them. So does that, you're trying to, in a certain extent, pull it back a little bit and trying to make it about us versus them. And he's trying to avoid that dualism here, at least a little bit. He's trying to say that spiritual, and he'll explain it. I cut it halfway through, Steve, so he's going to get there. But he's going to go to this concept of shleimut, which is, if anybody is excluded, then you do not have wholeness, and then there can be no sense of spirituality and no sense of justice. And so everyone, therefore, has to be included. So yes, you would definitely have to defend Jews just as much as you would have to defend anyone else. That's, I believe, where he's going with it, but we're gonna go on this journey together. Ben.
Yeah, I really like what you said about sort of zooming out. And I think a lot of the confusion in my mind is like, how far do you zoom out? I mean, I really sympathize with what Rabbi Lew is saying about taking care of the problem that's in front of you, right? And I think there was a time when we could assume that, well, our behavior impacts our community, right? But now we're kind of finding that our behavior can affect everybody, right? If we look at what's happened over the past couple of years, if we look about what we're finding out about climate change, right? Our behavior doesn't just affect those in our community. Our behavior can affect those all the way across the world.
And that's
so
my
how
problem.
How far do we zoom out?
Yeah, that's my problem with Tikkun Olam in general, and why I like to harp on Gemilut Chasadim, because if I tell someone the world is broken and we have to fix it, forget it. I mean, are you crazy? I fixed the world. Who am I? I can't fix the world. That you're setting up it's like, oh, if every person did this, the Messiah would come, right? If every person laid tefillin, the Messiah, you're setting up an expectation that's totally impossible, and it's unrealistic. And I think to a certain extent, part of
I think
being a rabbi is giving people practical things that they can do on a human level.
But we found out that we can break it further, right? We found out that human beings have the power to really break things that maybe weren't broken before, right? So if we've broken things for everybody, what responsibility do we have to fix those things?
What makes, well, Rabbi Lou's question at the end of that little section is what makes us think that we have any capacity as broken people to be able to fix the situation? That's a sign of great hubris, I think, is how he concluded that section. He's going to go on, but yes, I mean, that's, yeah, all your points are well taken, Ben. Becky.
I don't know how this fits in with what Ben just said, but I mean, I had so many thoughts going through my head just listening to that last piece. And I mean, maybe on the forefront was like the situation in Afghanistan and watching that and seeing real brokenness before our eyes. But what I wanted to say was just in thinking about some of the on the ground work that I've done volunteering in different places, like, you know, one of the interesting things that like people had always said to me about doing volunteerism, you know, like we had this project at Glide, at Beth Shalom, that kind of work. And I also used to work for the Jewish Coalition for Literacy, and that sort of divide between like the haves who are giving and the have-nots who are receiving, like, to me, that really breaks down in the actual work on the ground. Partially because, you know, I was just thinking about it, places like Glide, where the volunteers are not all haves. You know, you have people from the community volunteering, and there is no division when you're working shoulder to shoulder with people serving food. You're just all there. That's part A. And then I'll say just about like tutoring children. I mean, talk about a humbling experience where you're working with children who have so much wisdom. And my experience was always like, oh my God, I just got way more out of this than they did. You know, I'm just sitting here reading a book, but they're sharing their incredible wisdom with me. And I've come away from all of those experiences feeling like I just took away so much more than I gave. I mean, my heart is kind of exploding afterwards from what I took away from it. So it's a real, like, that's been a real eye opener for me about doing, you know, this kind of zoomed in volunteerism. So.
Yeah, it's called Gimilut Chasadim. Lisa.
So we are told that we don't have to complete the task. We just have to take it up. And one of the things Rabbi Lou used to talk about was just when you pass that homeless person on the street, don't look away, make eye contact, and give them money. Don't worry about what they're going to do with the money. Just give it.
I completely, for me, that is so essential and currently against the law. And when we want to think about the difficulty, I'm being slightly facetious, but when we want to think about the difficulty of interacting with people and the health of our society, that sense that we can't walk up to another human being and say hello and give them something and take off our face mask and show them our face. I think some of the stress and the fear that people are concerned about comes from that disconnection from other human people. So let's go on here, because that's such a, Lisa, you didn't even know you segued me, but boy, listen to this segue. This segue is going to go perfect. All right.
We human beings are profoundly mixed. We're created in the image of God. We are the bearers of divine light. But we are also broken. And in our brokenness, we can't find the light. The poet Kabir writes, I talk to my inner lover, and I say, why such a rush? We sense that there is some sort of spirit that loves birds and animals and ants, perhaps the same one who gave a radiance to you in your mother's womb. Is it logical you would be walking around entirely orphaned now? The truth is you turned away yourself and decided to go into the dark alone. And now you're tangled up in others and have forgotten what you once knew. And that's why everything you do has some weird failure in it. Sound familiar? Everything you do has some weird failure in it. So according to Kabir, this weird failure, this brokenness of the world, comes from our having turned away by ourselves and deciding to go into the dark alone. Did you ever listen? I know it's hard to listen when you're in shul on the high holidays, but did you ever listen to the Haftorah from Isaiah that we read every year on Yom Kippur morning? It's my favorite liturgical moment of the year. Because, we're sitting there, we've been fasting, gosh, by that time, maybe 12 whole hours. And so we're really feeling pious. We're really feeling, I'm really something. And then we hear God making fun of us through the prophet Isaiah. You think this is the fast I have chosen? Is this your affliction of the soul? To droop your head like a bulrush, to grovel in sackcloth and ashes? Is this what you call fasting, a fast Adonai would accept? This is my chosen fast. Loosen all the bonds that bind men unfairly. Let the oppressed go free. Break every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry. Take the homeless into your home. Clothe the naked when you see them. Do not turn away from people in need. Then a cleansing light will break forth like the dawn, and your wounds will all be healed. So for Isaiah, tikkun is turning. It turns us toward the light. And in the same gesture, we turn away from our own darkness. We turn away from that place where everything has some weird failure to it. When we turn towards others, when we feed the hungry, when we house the homeless, we move towards the light. I had an old friend named Sarah, and she had her 5 minutes of fame around 20 years ago. During that brief moment when homelessness was the fashionable social dysfunction of the moment. When newspaper reporters were all dressing up in rags and living on the streets for feature stories. And rock stars were giving concerts to benefit the people on the streets. Anyway, during this time, Sarah had a radical idea about the homeless, which no one had ever thought of before. She decided to try to talk to them. She even set up a foundation based on this idea in Marin County. She went to the homeless and engaged them in conversation. That was the whole idea. That was it, from start to finish. She asked them how they were doing. Did they need anything? Where were they from? How had they gotten into the predicament they were in, etc., etc. The results were immediate and spectacular. The homeless stopped harassing the merchants of Marin County and their customers for a while. And these grateful merchants poured money into Sarah's foundation like a never-ending stream. Now, my friend Sarah was a poet and not a very effective administrator. And before very long, her program went up in flames altogether. But before it did, she had her moment of instant celebrity. An article about her work appeared on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. And the next week, she was flown to New York, where she appeared on the Today Show, Good Morning America, and the CBS Morning Show. Tell us what it was like to talk to homeless people, Jane Pauley said. What did they say to you, Joan London wanted to know. What do the homeless want anyway, Harry Smith asked her. Of course, they were all completely unaware of the incredible irony of what was going on. They had flown Sarah 3,000 miles across the country to answer these questions when they could have easily discovered the answers themselves outside the lobbies of the very buildings they worked in. Every building in New York back then was virtually ringed with homeless people. But to these people, the homeless of New York may as well have been on Mars. So thoroughly had they consigned them to another world. Why had they done this? One day, also around 20 years ago, I was walking across the Park Presidio on my way to work. I used to work at a synagogue. When a man, my Park Presidio is, but it's like I can't explain it. It's got a little parkway, a little bit of green in between the roadways. When a man my age suddenly came out of the bushes right in my path, we frightened each other. He recoiled from me. He took 2 steps back when he saw me. And I realized he was afraid of being discovered. Maybe because they were in the middle of one of their periodic sweeps of the homeless in San Francisco. You know, they do this every 2 or 3 years. And he didn't want to get caught up in it, swept off the streets and into the maws of the legal system, only to be spat out again, only now bereft of whatever small and pitiable possessions he may have had before. Or maybe he recalled because it was simply the nature of his state, because he represented a part of us that doesn't want to be discovered. At least, this is what I felt very strongly at that moment, as we were recoiling from each other in a strange dance. He taking 2 steps back from me taking 2 steps back from him. He represented a part of me that I didn't want to see. The dirty part, the uncontrollable part. That part that might fall into the black pit of failure at any moment. That part that might go belly up and die. In short, he was a perfect picture of everything in life that frightened me to death. Of everything I couldn't control. Of all my own internal darkness. Death, failure, uncleanliness, anger, greed. No wonder I didn't want to look at him. No wonder I felt a wave of relief pass over me as he disappeared back into the bushes. But as soon as this wave passed, I felt something else as well. I felt how much fear there was in my reluctance to see this man. Precisely because we have such a strong sense of our own brokenness deep down. Whatever happens, whatever sense of success or well-being we might experience carries with it a subtle undercurrent of fear. When things are going well, when we are experiencing pleasure, when we're getting what we want, when we're successful, when we're in love, we feel obliged to defend our happiness because it feels so fragile, so unstable, so in need of constant protection. So we have to deny the very possibility of suffering. We have to cut ourselves off from facing it in ourselves and in others as well, because we feel that it threatens us. We're afraid it'll undermine or destroy our good fortune. And because deep down we know the truth. We are broken. Everything is broken. So in order to hold on to our own pleasure, we have to refuse to recognize the humanity of a homeless person we encounter on the street. We decide that his suffering isn't relevant to us. It's somehow outside us or beyond us. We cut ourselves off from facing the world's suffering because we're afraid it will undermine our own happiness.
Any thoughts? Anybody happy to give? I mean, this feels so relevant to me, especially with what we're experiencing now in our world. I wanted to open it up and see what people wanted to share. Nzinga, yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you were talking about Yom Kippur, think about it as being a rehearsal for death. But what strikes me about it is that sense of discomfort that you have in the midst of fasting, and the discomfort that you sometimes have to face in doing acts of Gemilut Hesed, and of facing the homeless person, of seeing them as seeing their humanity, of looking them in the eyes, of dealing with all of the things that come with that kind of an interaction. And I don't really have sort of a I don't have sort of any sort of a conclusion, but it just really strikes me that there is something about being comfortable with discomfort that could sometimes require.
Amen. Thank you, Nzinga. Shira.
I just wanted to share that I felt that was really powerful. And I always have this sense of that my strong urge to in some way serve vulnerable people in whatever, forms that, has taken in my life, it came from a sense of guilt and, something like that. And I think it's really striking to me personally to think about the ways that is even more personal, really, that in fact these, coming from a place of fear of those dark places that Rabbi Lew is describing. I'm just finding that to be really struck by that very powerfully, and I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Absolutely, I feel that. I struck very similarly to how you felt, and it's sort of an accusation on all of us and how we're acting in this world and who we want to be. It's the exact teaching we should have during this month of Elul. Steve.
Yes, when he was saying that this person wasn't relevant, to me, it's the other way around. It's very relevant. When I think how unstable our society is, I have concerns. Could my children wind up like that person sometime in the future? And I worry about that. And that's why I'm always trying to support my sons, because I don't know, if our society is turned upside down, could they wind up on the streets? And so for me, when I see someone like that, it's just a reminder about the uncertainty of the future, and it concerns me a lot.
Yeah, amen. And so much of the liturgy and the shofar and the Unetana Tokef is to bring that uncertainty into our consciousness. Judah.
Yeah, I wanted to share something with those who weren't at Beth Shalom when Rabbi Lew was, a program that was started under his tutelage and with Sarah Horowitz, another very holy soul that may her memory be for a blessing, who was at Beth Shalom. And they started a program of visiting prisoners, Jewish prisoners in Folsom Prison. So it wasn't only not ignoring somebody, it was actually searching them out, reaching out to them. And interestingly, it was started because there was a member of Beth Shalom who had been in Folsom Prison. But the program continues, and it's a long schlep from San Francisco to Folsom Prison. And I live in Sacramento now, and I'm continuing the program. I talked to Rabbi Glazer because fewer and fewer people were showing up to do it. But I can't begin to tell you what a wonderful feeling it is for these Jewish prisoners to know that there's a community outside that cares about them and supports them. And and this is Rabbi Lew in action. This is, walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Amen. And the presence of someone else, to get a visitor in prison, to have someone come and sit with you, a real physical human being, that presence is something we're going to continue to talk more about as we go deeper into Rabbi Lew in the upcoming sessions that we are going to have. One of the things that I'm going to I have a teaching here. I wanted to see if I can squeeze this teaching in here. But we are going to talk about suffering going forward, and the topics, in fact, Judah, that you just touched on, which is the obligation that we have to go out into the world. So we're going to continue doing that. And then, of course, if the world is full of suffering, how do we grapple with that suffering or that fear or that uncertainty and continue to move forward anyway? There's obviously so much to this topic that is hard to cover, but I think and thank you for sharing, what we experienced here is sort of the heart of basic humanity that sits at the heart of Rabbi Lew's understanding of what it means to be a human being, what it means to do Gemilut Chasadim, and what it means to do justice and social justice in this world, a sense of connection and wholeness that is inextricably connected to his sense of whole spirituality. If you have 5 minutes, so this class was going to end with this. And of course, it's not going to be a surprise to any of you. This is, of course, the poem that we read in our service, written by the Sarah that he was talking about in that story, Sarah Horowitz of blessed memory. And so I'm going to conclude our class this morning with this. And then if you want to hang around, Rabbi Lou has a little bit of a tachlis, because I really want to include practical advice for what you can do. In addition to this being a class, we are in Elul, so I hang around for 5 minutes after I read this. So now that we've heard that beautiful, yes.
May I say one thing before you do that?
Sure.
I always think when I see people who are less fortunate than I am, there but for the grace of God go I. And I think that's a very heart-moving way to realize that we may be fortunate in 1 second and unfortunate in the next, that we are not removed from these people, they are us.
Amen. Yeah, amen. But thereby, but the grace of God go I is a hard philosophy to hold in the midst of a pandemic. It is not, our society does not lean into that frame. Okay, so let's go and read this Sarah Horowitz poem. Ribono shel olam, let America be America. Let it be my land. Let it be your land. From the curvaceous hills of California to the New York Islands, let our tired, poor, huddled masses finally breathe free. Let our leaders pursue justice, justice, justice. Let them be mindful that we are all created equal, B'Tselem Elohim. Protect our leaders from the seductions of power. Protect our right to protest, to insist we can do better. Protect us all from those who would do us harm. Let America be America, and let us say, Amen. And so that's we have included that in our prayers. And as Judah noted, the story of Sarah Horowitz, poet of blessed memory, that Rabbi Lou shared with us. Okay, let me see in the chat here. All right, thank you. All right, so hang around now. That's the end. That's the formal end of my nice little class that I have structured for everybody here. But I'm going to let it go rolling because I have another teaching that's in reference to this week's Torah portion. So for anybody, this would be the bonus feature on the video. All right, so the bonus feature is a teaching that comes from Rabbi Lou's book, This is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared, and it comes from this week's Torah portion, and I'm going to take the opportunity to share that with you. Judah.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly share that expression, there for the grace of God. I've come to personally, I don't use it anymore because to me it implies that other people don't have the grace of God. And I don't like to, that doesn't.
Yeah, I can hear, I've never heard it in that valence, but I can understand. Thank you, Jude. I can understand hearing it that way. All right, so here's Parshat Ki Titze, which is this week's Torah portion. Rabbi Lou writes, which we read during the 3rd week of Elul, also derives a lesson on the kind of mindfulness. Now, if you remember when we talked about the practical, what are we all going to do? We talked about Rabbi Lou eating too fast. We talked about slowing down. We talked about having something that we were going to focus on this month. So he says, Ki Titze, oddly enough, derives a lesson in the kind of mindfulness we are trying to cultivate from the laws of war. Images of war abound during Elul. On the first day of Elul, we begin to add the 27th Psalm to our morning prayers. You know, the one that goes, Achat sha'alti mebeit Adonai, ohota avakesh. So Rabbi Russell sings it much better than I do. That's the one, that's Psalm 27. And the line in there says, though armies are arrayed against me, I will have no fear. Though war threatens, I will remain steadfast in my faith. That's kind of how I have traditionally heard that phrase. Reads the 27th Psalm. It's as if the tradition is trying to tell us this business of becoming aware of our.
I'm going to have lunch.
Okay.
This business, if you got somebody, I have to unmute somebody there. That's okay. This business of becoming aware of ourselves is a matter of life and death. This business of finding out who we really are, needs to be approached with the focus and energy of a military campaign. So in any case, whereas last week's Torah portion, Parshat Shoftim, got its lessons about mindful awareness. We talked about in that moment before entering into battle, who was allowed to go home and take care of their vineyards or build their house and take care of their family, or who had to go into battle. Rabbi Lou says here in Ki Tzitze, we focus on the moment just afterwards. When you have been victorious in battle, the Parsha begins, and you are carrying away captives, and you find amongst the captives a beautiful woman with a good figure, and you want to take her for yourself, first to be your wife. First, you must bring her into your house and have her shave her head and cut off her fingernails and remove the dress she was wearing when you captured her. She must remain in your house, weeping for her father and her mother for a full month. And after that, you may come to her and be her husband. Now, if you're perhaps not familiar with Rabbi Lou, you might wonder why in the world is Rabbi Lou picking out this section to talk about mindfulness in the month of Elul. And this is really quintessential Rabbi Lou. This passage deals with a rather ugly human impulse that's as ancient as the hills and as current as the day before yesterday. And somebody mentioned Afghanistan, literally yesterday. Men victorious in war, raging testosterone unleashed by battle, and now utterly unrestrained grape and rape. The first women that they see on the streets of the cities they have just vanquished. Ancient art and literature, and literally yesterday's newspapers are full of this disturbing human tendency. Greek and Shakespearean tragedy. He goes on to say that this is always, he says here on the top here, always been and continues to be one of the most troublesome of human impulses. Nor are the implements for arousing desire any less universal or current. Elul always falls in the late summer, and I do weddings almost every Sunday then. Standing under the chuppah with bride and groom on the week we read Parshat Ki Tzitze, I am often reminded that carefully done fingernails, well-coiffed hair, and alluring dresses are still frequently employed to arouse a passion in a man sufficient to get him under the wedding canopy. The Torah is not really concerned with the specific case of the woman captured in battle. It had a larger principle in mind, and it seems to be suggesting a method for dealing with the tyranny of passion and desire of our lives in general. Now, the raging lust of the victorious soldier is only one instance, one example of that desire for which we humans throw away our lives, the living death we bring upon ourselves. He quotes John Keats. I'm going to skip the Keats poem, but he says, the impulse Keats describes arises in our lives in many forms. It shows itself in the impulse that might seduce us into a ruinous midlife affair, or that might cause us to sacrifice our families for ambition, or to give up our heart's work for the pursuit of material excess, or to give up our integrity for fame or fortune, or God for the pursuit of pleasure. Given how pernicious and pervasive such impulses are, how much damage they could do to us, we might find ourselves asking, why doesn't the Torah just do away with them altogether? Why doesn't the Torah just tell us not to take the woman captive in the first place, right? I can't tell you how many times I've taught this Parsha and people just struggle with this for good reason, by the way. There's a lot to struggle with here. And the question, Rabbi, why not just say no? Don't do that. Rabbi Lou has an answer. I think that there may be several ways of answering that question. First off, it would have been unrealistic for the Torah to have done so. And the Torah is above all an extremely realistic work. The Torah never permits too much distance between the values it proposes and the way people actually behave, because it recognizes that to do so would break the connection between our lives and the Torah. So the Torah can't afford to do too much violence to the way we are, and this lustful impulse, unfortunately, is repeated throughout history. But trying to efface the impulse altogether might not have been unrealistic, he says. Not only is it not possible, you couldn't have gotten rid of it. It would have been foolhardy. You have to acknowledge it at some level. He's saying, but it might also be undesirable. Like everything we have been given in this life, this impulse might also have its place, its use. This impulse, in fact, might be part and parcel of the process of human creativity. This, at least, is a suggestion of a story that is told in the Talmud, in Masechet Yoma. The children of Israel, it seems, once prayed to a god that the impulse that tempted them into sexual misconduct be handed over to them as captive. After they fasted for 3 days and nights, this tempter was in fact handed over to them, and the prophet warned them that if they killed it, they would bring the world down with it. So they imprisoned it for 3 days instead. But there wasn't a fresh egg to be found in the entire land of Israel for those 3 days. Finally, they just put out its eyes and let it loose again. The Talmud seems to be saying that this business of desire is the basis of our creativity, our productivity. Our desire for the apple in the Garden of Eden got us kicked out of Eden, but it also propelled us into history. And if we try to squelch that or bury it, we might stop being productive. So since we can't and possibly shouldn't repress our desires, and since it is often a calamity when we follow them, what should we do? Ki Titze gives us an answer. The soldiers at the beginning have to live with their desire and to watch it and not act on it for a month. And the second thing we learn is that once we have our desires firmly in view, we can strip them of their exotic dress. We can make them cut off their fingernails and their hair. We can make them take off that revealing frock they were wearing. In other words, we can see them for what they really are. He quotes Jim Carroll in the Basketball Diaries, talking about how he was in an elevator and he wanted to make a move on a beautiful woman, but the elevator took too long. And as the elevator kept going up, he realized that he didn't have any desire for the woman at all. It was the need to have his very weak ego affirmed by another conquest. It was the need to cover up the bottomless pit of emptiness he felt with another rush of strong sensation. Rabbi Lew asks, why do we run after that ambition? Why do we need those conquests? Better simply to strip them of their romance and watch them for a month before acting on them, before taking them to yourself. And what better time to do this than the month of Elul, the month we are supposed to devote to the regular cultivation of self-awareness. The month we begin the process of teshuvah by shifting our gaze from the world outside to the consciousness through which we view the world. Certainly desire is a significant component. He says maybe the most. So this is something else that we all can do here during the month of Elul. We can devote a bit of time each day to locating our particular Beldam San Marci, to identifying whatever desire has disordered our lives, the beautiful delusion for which we've thrown everything away or for which we stand ready to do so in any case. And when we've located it, all we have to do is look at it. We don't have to kill it. We don't have to act on it either. We can just let it arise in the fullness of its being, unromantically stripped down to the naked impulse that it is, without the finery of romance, without hair, nails, or dress, just the impulse. And you can watch this impulse for the entire month of Elul. And if after the month it still seems like something we want, something that continues to arouse a strong feeling in us, then we've learned something useful about ourselves. But if this desire, stripped of its romantic trappings, simply fades away, then we've learned something even more useful. We've learned that there is more to heaven and earth than those things on the surface of the world that provoke desire in our hearts. We've learned that if we always act on our desires, on those unmitigated impulses that constantly rise up in our hearts and our minds, we are doomed to a living death, doomed to always palely loitering after a lock of hair, after a bit of nail and cloth, the ghostly phantoms of desire. Psalm 27, wait on God, be strong and courageous of heart, and wait on God. This is the very good advice of that same Psalm 27 that we recite twice a day during the month of Elul. It is better to wait on God, better to just watch our impulses arise and wait for truth, wait for something deeper. Better to be strong of heart than to surrender our lives to the empty stuff of desire and to spend the rest of our lives palely loitering on a coal-hit side where no birds sing. Steve.
Yeah, yes. This particular parsha, to me, the central theme of the parsha is maintaining order. And so you read again and again that anyone who threatens that order, any behavior which threatens that order, they're taken out and stoned to death. There's no re-education. The important thing is maintaining order in the community. And you see that again and again throughout this parsha, how important that was.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Steve. And maintaining order also not only in the community, but in your heart, not just running after things. Is there something we want to buy? Is there something that we all want to purchase and have in our homes that we really want to rush out and purchase it? And sometimes maybe we purchase things online in the middle of the night. I don't know anybody who does that, but maybe we do. Well, the month of Elul, wait. And if you still want it after 30 days, then you'll learn something useful about yourself. And if you don't, you certainly will as well. So that's the practical tachlis advice that I wanted to end this bonus section of Ein on Lu today. So thank you all for coming. We're going to talk more, as I mentioned, about suffering as we head into the Yamim Noraim. How do we deal with bad things happening in our world? And how do we move forward in light of that? So that's going to be next week as we move closer to the Yamim Noraim. Thank you all for joining us and have a good rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.